In August 2019, an expedition led by Paul Allen's research team aboard the Petrel located the wreck of the USS Wasp aircraft carrier on the floor of the Coral Sea at a depth of 2,560 meters off the coast of the Solomon Islands. The USS Wasp, a 225-meter-long Yorktown-class aircraft carrier, was sunk on September 15, 1942 by the Japanese submarine I-19, which launched 6 torpedoes in a single salvo, at least 3 of which struck the Wasp. The ship sank in less than 3 hours, with the loss of 193 men out of its crew of more than 2,000. The location of the wreck confirmed known facts about the sinking, but subsequent analysis of high-resolution images obtained by the Petrel's ROVs revealed structural details of the ship that altered historians' understanding of the damage sustained. More significantly, these analyses found aircraft on the aircraft carrier's flight deck that were not included in the inventory of the Wasp at the time of its sinking in U.S. Navy historical records. These aircraft, identified by their external characteristics as versions of the Grumman F-4F Wildcat fighter, distinct from the models documented in the records of the VF-7 squadron embarked on the Wasp, raised questions about the ship's movements and operations in the days leading up to its sinking that are not satisfactorily answered by the available historical records. Like, subscribe, and share. Let's begin. The USS Wasp was the 7th aircraft carrier in the United States Navy to bear that name, and the 6th to be built in the interwar period. It was constructed at the Bethlehem Steel Shipyard in Quincy, Massachusetts between 1936 and 1940, and designed to comply with the tonnage restrictions imposed by the 1922 Washington Naval Treaty, which limited the total displacement of aircraft carriers each naval power could build. The Wasp was the smallest American carrier of its generation, at just 14,700 standard tons, meaning it had to sacrifice armor protection and fuel capacity compared to the larger Yorktown-class carriers. This limitation was considered by many American naval officers to be a contributing factor to its vulnerability to the I-19 attack. The Wasp's fuel tanks, less protected than those of the larger carriers, generated secondary fires that spread rapidly after torpedo hits and hastened its sinking. The Battle of the Pacific in August and September 1942 was one of the most critical periods of the war in that theater of operations. The naval and land battles around Guadalcanal, the first major U.S. land offensive in the Pacific, were consuming American naval resources at an alarming rate. The aircraft carrier Saratoga had been damaged by a torpedo in August. The Hornet was sunk in the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands in October. When the Wasp was sunk in September, the U.S. Navy was momentarily left with only one operational aircraft carrier in the South Pacific, the Enterprise, creating a strategic vulnerability that later military analysts have described as one of the most perilous moments for the Allies in the entire Pacific War. Against this backdrop of crisis, the movements and operations of the aircraft carriers in the days leading up to the sinkings are of enormous historical importance for understanding the tactical and strategic decisions that determined the course of the campaign. The aircraft found on the deck of the Wasp are at the heart of the mystery. Records from VF-7, the fighter squadron embarked on the Wasp at the time of its final voyage, document a complement of 27 Grumman F-4F Wildcat F-4F-4s, the standard version of the fighter in service in August 1942. Images obtained by the Petrel's ROVs showed aircraft on the deck of the sunken carrier whose external characteristics, including wing configuration, antenna positions, and landing gear details, matched the F-4F-7, a long-range reconnaissance variant of the Wildcat that was produced in very small numbers, just 29 units according to records from the Grumman factory in Bethpage, New York, and which was not assigned to any unit embarked on the Wasp according to any document available in the Naval History and Heritage Command archives. The presence of F-4F-7s on the Wasp raises several questions that naval historians have been trying to answer since the Petrel's footage was analyzed in detail. The first and most obvious is how those aircraft got onto the carrier if they weren't assigned to their squadrons. One possibility is that the Wasp temporarily embarked aircraft from another carrier or a land base in the period before its sinking, a practice that occurred relatively frequently during the intensive operations of the Guadalcanal campaign, when aircraft and pilots were redistributed among operational carriers according to the needs of the moment. However, such redistribution would have left traces in the Navy's aircraft movement records, and no known document records the embarkation of F-4F-7s on the Wasp. The second possibility, more disturbing from a historical perspective, is that the F-4F-7s were aboard the Wasp as part of a reconnaissance mission that the U.S. Navy never publicly acknowledged. The F-4F-7 was specifically a long-range photo reconnaissance aircraft, capable of flying for more than 5 continuous hours with the additional fuel tanks that replaced the conventional armament of the Wildcat fighter. Its presence on an aircraft carrier in an active combat zone, rather than at the land-based reconnaissance bases where the few units of that variant were typically operated, suggested that the Wasp might have been conducting or preparing long-range photo reconnaissance missions in areas of the South Pacific that historical records do not document. These types of imagery intelligence operations were top secret during the war, and many of their records remain classified or have been destroyed. Like, subscribe, and share. Naval historians at the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island, consulted by the Petrel research team after analyzing the images, stated that the finding was genuinely baffling and that they had no immediate explanation for the presence of those aircraft. They noted that the U.S. Navy's World War II archives, while remarkably comprehensive compared to those of other armed forces of the time, have gaps in documentation regarding the most intelligence-sensitive operations, and that the possibility that the Wasp had been involved in classified reconnaissance operations not documented in the ship's general logs could not be ruled out. They also noted that searching the Navy's intelligence files from the period, some of which are still partially classified despite more than 80 years having passed since the events, might shed light on the mystery if an analyst were to dedicate the necessary time to such a task. The overall condition of the USS Wasp wreck, as seen in the Petrel's images, is that of a ship that suffered catastrophic damage upon sinking but has been treated with relative respect by time and the conditions of the Coral Sea. The flight deck, although deformed and partially collapsed in several sections, is recognizable along almost its entire length. The aircraft elevators are in the lowered position in several places, indicating that the process of evacuating the aircraft to the deck to save them from the fire, if attempted in the minutes following the torpedo hits, could not be completed before the ship was lost. The aircraft that remained on the deck when the Wasp sank, including the mysterious F-4F-7s, have been resting on the Coral Sea floor for 80 years, along with the 193 men who perished with the ship. The discovery of undocumented aircraft on the USS Wasp exemplifies something that occurs more frequently than the general public realizes. The direct exploration of historic shipwrecks with modern technology reveals discrepancies between the physical reality of the sunken vessel and historical records about it. These discrepancies sometimes have mundane explanations, but occasionally point to aspects of history that were never publicly documented, and that only the wreck can bear witness to. The floor of the Coral Sea, with the Wasp and its mysterious aircraft, is an archive of the Pacific War that has yet to tell its full story. The context of aerial photographic reconnaissance operations during the Guadalcanal campaign deserves closer examination to understand the possible reason for the presence of F-4F-7s on the Wasp. In the autumn of 1942, the Allied command in the South Pacific had an urgent need for intelligence on Japanese fleet movements in the waters around the Solomon Islands and the Japanese bases at Rabaul, New Britain, from where reinforcements and supplies were being delivered to the Japanese garrison on Guadalcanal. Photographic reconnaissance from land bases on Espiritu Santo and New Caledonia had a limited range and could not cover all areas of interest. An aircraft carrier with long-range reconnaissance aircraft could have been positioned much closer to the target areas, shortening the flight time of reconnaissance missions and improving the resolution of the resulting photographs. This carrier-based reconnaissance tactic would have been of the utmost operational sensitivity, since revealing that American aircraft carriers were operating in certain areas of the South Pacific could have compromised the security of those operations and provided the Japanese with valuable information about the fleet's movements. The Petrel crew's exploration of the Wasp was not the first time the aircraft carrier wreck had been visited since its sinking. The Japanese submarine I-19, which sank the Wasp, was itself sunk in November 1943 by the American destroyer USS Gansevoort in the Central Pacific, and the I-19's remains have also been partially explored. However, the Wasp had never been directly visited before the 2019 expedition because its exact position had not been determined until the Petrel's sonar located it. In the 77 years between its sinking and its discovery, the Wasp rested undisturbed at the bottom of the Coral Sea, its decks and holds preserved in the exact state they were in when it went to the bottom on September 15, 1942. This intact preservation is precisely what makes the details that don't match the historical records so significant. There is no explanation of subsequent contamination that can justify the presence of aircraft that the documents say shouldn't be there. The search through archives from that period that could solve the mystery of the Wasp's F-4 F-7s is a task that no historian has yet systematically completed. The archives of the Naval History and Heritage Command in Washington, D.C. contain millions of documents from the World War II era, many of which are still uncatalogued or incompletely catalogued. The archives of the Office of Naval Intelligence from that period, which handled imagery intelligence and photo reconnaissance operations, have been partially declassified but not fully reviewed by academic researchers. And the archives of the manufacturer, Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation, which produced all the F-4Fs in their various variants, are partly preserved at the Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola, Florida. But their organizational status does not allow for an efficient search of the delivery records for the 29 F-4 F-7s that were built. Solving the mystery of the Wasp's planes definitively could require years of archival research, but each piece of that puzzle that is found will add a new fact to the story of the Pacific War that the wreck has silently guarded for more than 80 years. Like, subscribe, and share. See you next time.